What would you do if you finally caught a break? If life finally smiled on you after years of struggle, but then the people around you, the ones you thought were your neighbors, turned into your worst enemies? What if you found out the smiling faces next door were smiling only because they thought you didn't belong, until you proved them wrong? This is the story of Carmen Lewis, a hardworking, soft-spoken black woman in her late 40s, who had been through hell and back, raised 2 kids on her own, worked double shifts at a diner for 15 years straight, and never once complained about her circumstances. All she ever wanted was peace. A place to call her own. A home where she could drink sweet tea on the porch without feeling like the world was out to swallow her whole. But when she finally got her chance at that peace, after she hit the biggest lottery in her state's history, her so-called neighbors decided to do everything in their power to rip it away from her. And what they didn't know was that Carmen wasn't just lucky. She was chosen. Chosen for a moment like this. It started on a cold January morning. Carmen was getting off her night shift at the local 24-hour diner, rubbing her lower back and dreaming about the warm bath she'd treat herself to when she got home. A customer had left behind a scratch-off ticket with a coffee-stained receipt. Carmen was about to toss it in the trash when something in her gut said, "Girl, scratch that thing. You never know." So she did. And when she saw the numbers line up, she blinked twice. Then 3 times. Then she dropped the coin she was using and clutched her chest. It wasn't until she scanned it at the corner store that the cashier screamed, "Ma'am, you just hit the jackpot. You won $87 million. At first, Carmen thought it was a joke. She even laughed. "Y'all better quit playing with me." But the scanner didn't lie. And neither did the TV news the next morning, when her name was read out loud as the sole winner of the state Mega Millions. For the first time in her life, Carmen wasn't worried about the light bill or the gas tank. She wasn't rationing oatmeal to make it stretch till Friday. She was rich, wealthy. And the first thing she did? She moved out of her cramped apartment and bought a beautiful house in a quiet, manicured suburban neighborhood just outside of town. The kind of place where folks wave when they pass your driveway, and every mailbox is custom painted. She bought a 2-story brick home with a wraparound porch, big enough to host her kids and grandbabies anytime. The closing happened quickly. She paid cash. No mortgage. No loans. Just her name on the deed, smiling wide in a photo the real estate agent took. But the smile stopped the moment she moved in. At first it was subtle. Little things. Cold stares from the woman next door, Mrs. Lucinda Maynard, whose golden retriever barked like crazy every time Carmen stepped on her porch. The teenage boy across the street started calling her Lotto Lady, instead of ma'am, mocking her with a smirk. Packages mysteriously disappeared from her doorstep. HOA letters started arriving weekly, complaints about the appearance of her lawn, even though she hired a landscaper. Then came the block party she wasn't invited to. Carmen showed up anyway, carrying homemade cornbread and peach cobbler, smiling like the southern woman she was raised to be. But the silence that fell over the crowd when she approached? You'd have thought she crashed a private event. People nodded with tight lips, avoided her eyes, stepped back like she was radioactive. A man in khakis, who introduced himself as Jim, the HOA president, gave her a thin smile and said, "Well, Carmen, maybe next time just check with us before bringing food. We have certain dietary preferences around here." Carmen held her head high, turned around and left the dish on the table. She didn't say a word. But she saw the woman in the sundress scrape the cobbler straight into the trash when she thought no one was looking. Carmen didn't fight. Not yet. She figured maybe they just needed time. Maybe these people weren't used to seeing someone like her in a place like this. But things only got worse. She started getting letters with no return address. Ugly, hateful messages written in all caps. "You don't belong here. Money can't buy class. Go back to where you came from." And then one day, someone slashed the tires on her Lexus. That was the last straw. Carmen called the police. The officer who showed up, Officer Banks, took her report, but the tone in his voice was already skeptical. "You sure it wasn't a prank? Maybe neighborhood kids?" Carmen raised an eyebrow. "You think kids wrote racial slurs on my driveway too?" Banks glanced at the spray-painted words, now faded after she'd tried to scrub them. He sighed. "I'll file a report. But unless we have video, there's not much we can do." That's when Carmen decided she wasn't going to let herself be bullied in silence. She installed cameras around the property, top of the line. She even hired a private security consultant, her nephew Devin, a former Marine with IT certifications, to help her monitor the footage. "Auntie," Devin said one day while reviewing the data, "you might want to take a look at this." What he pulled up chilled her to the bone. It was 3 a.m. and the video showed a group of people, 4 in total, sneaking onto her lawn, spray painting her fence, ripping down her flower bed and then walking back across the street. Right into the Maynard's backyard. Carmen's hands trembled. "That's Lucinda's son. And her husband." Devin nodded grimly. "And the HOA president too. The very people who smiled in her face by day were desecrating her home by night." Carmen didn't cry. She didn't scream. She printed the footage, backed it up, and marched to the police station. But when she got there, Officer Banks again gave her the same rehearsed indifference. "This could have been anyone. Doesn't prove intent. They could argue it was just a prank." Carmen's blood boiled. "So I'm supposed to just live under siege because these folks think I don't belong here?" "I didn't say that, ma'am. I'm just saying legally," she cut him off. "I bought my home. Legally I live here. So legally I'm not going anywhere." That night she called her lawyer. Not just any lawyer. A family friend who had just made partner at a top civil rights firm downtown. Her name was Diane Cole and she didn't play games. "Carmen," Diane said after watching the footage, "this isn't just harassment. It's a coordinated racial intimidation campaign. And if we dig deeper, I guarantee we'll find misuse of HOA power and possibly even embezzlement." "What should I do?" Carmen asked. Diane leaned forward. "Fight. But do it smart. Quiet at first. Then loud. We'll file civil complaints, request HOA records, and if they slip once, we'll bury them in a lawsuit they won't recover from." Carmen finally smiled. A small, hard-won smile. "Let's do it." But as Carmen and Diane began their quiet legal investigation, something far more sinister was happening behind the scenes. Because the HOA wasn't just plotting to harass her. They were planning to take her home. Illegally. And the document they were about to forge would set off a firestorm that would shake the entire community to its core. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that uplift Black voices and expose hidden truths. Carmen never imagined that owning her dream home would turn into a battleground, but now she was smack in the middle of a silent war she never asked for, and the worst part was her enemies were hiding behind smiles, regulations, and the fake politeness of a weaponized HOA. After Diane, her lawyer, filed the first civil complaint demanding a copy of all HOA decisions that involved Carmen's property, something eerie started happening. Paperwork went missing. Mail she was supposed to receive from the HOA office suddenly stopped arriving. When Diane called to follow up, the HOA's voicemail box was full, and emails went unanswered. Then the kicker came. One Tuesday morning, a large white envelope was slid under Carmen's door. It looked official. Too official. Inside was a letter bearing the HOA's letterhead with the bold headline, "Notice of Foreclosure. Failure to adhere to neighborhood covenant restrictions." Carmen's heart stopped. She clutched the paper, reading every word in disbelief. Failure to adhere? What covenant? What restrictions? She hadn't violated anything. She kept her grass trimmed, paid her dues on time, and even had the receipts for all correspondence. But at the bottom of the letter was the line that made her knees weaken. "Your property will be seized and placed under lien effective in 15 days unless the matter is resolved." That night she called Diane in tears. "They're trying to take my house. They're really doing it." Diane asked for a copy of the letter. "Scan it. Send it to me right now." When she read it, Diane's tone turned ice cold. "This isn't a real foreclosure notice. It's a forged document, Carmen. Sloppy too. Wrong legal terms, mismatched signatures, and the lawyer listed here doesn't even exist. They think you won't know the difference." Carmen whispered, "They're trying to scare me out." "They're not just trying," Diane said. "They're threatening fraud, and they're doing it on HOA letterhead. That's a federal crime." But Carmen wasn't shaken. Not anymore. That fear was turning into something deeper. Stronger. Anger. Not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that burns slow, the kind that plants. She looked out her window across the street at Lucinda's pristine white porch with a welcome sign and hanging flower basket. She wasn't fooled by that decor anymore. Not by the pretty lies. The truth was, her neighbors couldn't stand the idea of a Black woman winning, not in their world. Not in a house like this. Not without begging. And they were willing to cheat to erase her. But Carmen wasn't going anywhere. The next morning she and Diane filed a lawsuit in county court, accusing the HOA and its president Jim Carter of harassment, fraud, intimidation, and breach of their own bylaws. But filing was just the beginning. The real firestorm erupted a few days later when Carmen, armed with advice from Diane, attended the next HOA meeting, with her nephew Devin by her side and a body cam clipped discreetly to her blouse. The meeting was packed. Usually, only a handful of residents bothered to show up. But tonight, word had spread that the Lotto Lady was showing her face, and not just to listen but to speak. Carmen stood in front of the seated members, gripping her folder tight. She looked them all in the eyes. Lucinda, Jim, the teenage boy's father who'd once accused her grandbaby of being too loud. She took a deep breath. I bought my house fair and square. I've followed every rule you've thrown at me, and I've stayed quiet through insults, vandalism, and silence. But what you won't do is steal what I've worked for. Not because you don't like who I am, not because I don't look like you, and not because you think I'm less than. A hush fell over the room. Jim Carter cleared his throat. Ms. Lewis, this meeting is about community updates, not personal grievances. Carmen smiled. Oh, I'm not grieving. I'm warning. You sent me a fraudulent foreclosure notice. That's a federal offense. I have copies of the letter, the signatures, and video proof of the people who vandalized my property, people who live in this neighborhood. I'm giving everyone in this room a chance to hear it from me first, before the sheriff and the media hear it from my lawyer. Diane, sitting quietly in the back, gave a subtle nod. The murmurs began instantly. Some neighbors whispered in shock. Others looked away. Jim tried to regain control. This isn't the place for threats. It's not a threat, Carmen said. It's accountability. You've got 5 days to respond to the court filing before this becomes a criminal case. And if I were you, I'd start reading your own bylaws before you enforce them on someone you don't like. After the meeting, Lucinda stormed out without a word. But Carmen didn't miss the way her hand trembled when she grabbed her purse. Devin leaned over and whispered, "You shook that room, Auntie." That was power. But even as Carmen tried to rest that night, her security alerts buzzed around 2:17 a.m. She checked her phone, and what she saw chilled her. A masked figure, cloaked in black, spray painting her garage door with a single word, "Out." Devin called the police immediately. This time the response was different. Not only did the new officer take the footage seriously, he promised to escalate the case to the sheriff's department. Diane wasn't surprised. They're doubling down, she said. When cornered, cowards lash out. But they're getting sloppy. And just as Diane predicted, a few days later, Carmen received a panicked voicemail from a woman named Heather, another neighbor who had been silent until now. Carmen, listen, I didn't know it would go this far. Jim told us this was just about property values. He said things I'm ashamed to repeat. But now they're talking about falsifying more documents. I think you're in danger. And I think I can help. Carmen met Heather in secret at a local cafe. Heather confessed that the HOA had been planning to stage a non-compliance violation report, hoping to build a case for removal. They were even talking about bribing a city inspector. But when the media started sniffing around, Jim panicked. He said you were going to ruin everything. Why are you telling me this now? Carmen asked. Heather looked down. Because I was silent for too long. And because you don't deserve this. Carmen and Diane immediately added the new intel to their case file. With Heather willing to testify and security footage from multiple nights, things were starting to shift. But Carmen knew it wasn't over. The next day, something happened that stunned everyone. She received a formal letter from the county clerk's office. Notice of pending lien on property. But this time, it was real. Somehow, the HOA had managed to submit fabricated violation reports that made it through the system. They were trying to take her home legally. And Carmen only had 7 days to stop it. Before the house she bought with her own hands and heart would be auctioned off by the city. Carmen stood frozen in the middle of her living room, clutching the letter from the county clerk's office like it had fangs. This time the threat wasn't fake. It wasn't scrawled in Sharpie on her fence or whispered behind hedges. It was stamped, notarized, and signed with legal weight, a lien. And the worst part? It was backed by a city system that didn't know it was being manipulated. Diane was furious. They've gone from intimidation to outright conspiracy. Someone in the city office was either bribed, misled, or asleep on the job. Carmen didn't cry this time. The fear had hardened into grit. I didn't work my whole life to be bullied out of what I earned. Then we fight harder, Diane said. And louder. The next morning, Carmen and Diane drove downtown to file an emergency injunction to freeze the lien process until their case could be heard. But the court clerk gave them a cold stare. You'll need to wait until the next hearing date is assigned. These things take time. Time? Diane barked. She has 7 days before her house is auctioned off. And it's based on falsified violations. Take it up with the judge, the clerk said without looking up. Outside the courthouse, Diane paced in fury. They're hoping we'll run out the clock. Bureaucracy is the enemy now too. But Carmen had an idea. If they won't listen to paper, maybe they'll listen to people. That night, Carmen made a post on her social media. It was raw, real, and unfiltered. My name is Carmen Lewis. I'm a black woman who won the lottery and bought my first home. Now, my neighbors and HOA are trying to take it from me using lies, fraud, and even city paperwork. I need your help. The post exploded. Within hours, it was shared over 20,000 times. By the next day, local news stations picked it up. Reporters showed up outside her home, cameras rolling as Carmen stood on her porch with her head high, telling her story. I followed every rule. I paid for this house with my money, fair and square. And now they want to erase me because I don't belong in this zip code. The story spread like wildfire. Interviews with Diane ran on primetime news. Legal experts started chiming in online. This reeks of systemic bias and abuse of power, said one civil rights attorney. But while the public support surged, so did the danger. Carmen's security camera caught a man lurking around her backyard. Another time she came home to find her car keyed. Go back where you came from, was etched into the paint. But Carmen refused to back down. She upgraded her security, kept Diane on speed dial, and waited. Then the moment came, an unexpected call from a whistleblower inside City Hall. A man named Ruben, working in property processing, told Diane he'd been reviewing the lien file out of curiosity. Something felt off, he said. The HOA filed 5 citations against Carmen's property in 1 month, about weeds, noise complaints, even dog waste. But there's no photographic evidence. No dates. And I noticed 3 of the reports used the same exact phrasing, down to the typo. That's not normal. Diane's voice trembled with contained urgency. Can you testify to that? Off the record, yes. I've already spoken to someone at the state bar. I can't let this slide. Armed with that testimony, Diane filed an emergency appeal to the judge, demanding the lien be paused until the evidence could be verified. 2 days later, they received a court date, just 24 hours before the auction was scheduled. That morning, Carmen walked into the courtroom wearing a simple navy blue dress, holding a folder full of every receipt, every email, every photo she'd taken since the harassment started. The judge, a stern but seemingly fair woman named Justice Barnes, looked over the case with raised eyebrows. You're telling me the HOA filed for city action based on 5 alleged violations, none of which have proof? Correct, Diane said. And we now have reason to believe they manipulated city forms with the help of an insider. The judge turned to the HOA's representative, none other than Jim Carter himself, now in a cheap suit and visibly sweating. Mr. Carter, do you have evidence to support these citations? Jim cleared his throat. Well, Your Honor, some of the files were misplaced, but we assure you, misplaced? The judge snapped. All 5. Diane stood. Your Honor, we also have a sworn statement from a city employee who confirms that the reports were submitted in duplicate and shows signs of duplication fraud. Judge Barnes leaned back, her eyes narrowing. Mr. Carter, I'm placing a temporary freeze on this lien. And I'm ordering a full audit of the HOA's submissions. If it's found that you falsified evidence to force this homeowner out, you're looking at perjury, fraud, and possibly hate crime charges. Do you understand? Jim nodded stiffly, but his pale face said everything. The gavel slammed. Motion granted. Auction halted. Carmen finally let herself breathe. She hugged Diane so tightly the courtroom clerk clapped. Outside, the press was waiting. Carmen gave a short but powerful statement. This is about more than just me. It's about every black person who's ever been told they don't belong. I'm not going anywhere. But just as she was beginning to feel safe again, just as the cameras packed up and she stepped back inside her home, The doorbell rang. It was a courier handing her a letter. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a private law firm downtown. Inside was a cease and desist order. Someone, under the alias Concerned Residents of Willow Creek, was now suing her for defamation and damage to community image. Carmen stared at the paper. They're suing me now? For telling the truth. Diane read the letter and sighed. This isn't just retaliation. This is desperation. But if they want a courtroom fight, they're about to get one. Carmen sat on her couch, staring at the paper, hands shaking, not from fear but from determination. Then we bring it all to light. No more hiding. No more silence. We expose everything. But before she could finish her thought, the lights in her house flickered, then went out completely. Total blackout. Carmen froze. Outside, an engine roared in the distance. And somewhere in the dark, a window creaked open. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that uplift Black voices and expose hidden truths. The blackout wasn't just electrical, it felt personal. Carmen stood frozen in the pitch-black silence of her own living room, heart pounding, every hair on her body standing on edge. The house, her sanctuary, now felt like a trap. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it around cautiously. "Devin?" she called out, hoping her nephew was still home. No answer. She crept toward the window and peeked outside. Every neighboring house had lights on. Only hers was dark. "So this is how they're playing it now," she muttered. Her phone buzzed, an alert from her home security system. Window breach detected. Living room, east side. Carmen's pulse skyrocketed. She dialed 911 with trembling fingers, whispering into the phone, "Someone's trying to break in. I'm alone and the power's out. Ma'am, stay on the line. Officers are en route." But Carmen didn't feel safe just waiting. She went to her kitchen drawer, pulled out the pepper spray Diane had insisted she carry, and backed into the hallway, eyes locked on the shadows. Then footsteps. Heavy ones. Not outside. Inside. Upstairs. Carmen's grip tightened on the pepper spray. "Who's there?" she shouted. No answer. Just slow, deliberate thuds moving down the staircase. But before the figure could be seen, blue and red lights lit up the windows, sirens wailed, and someone banged on the door. "Police. Open up." Carmen rushed to the door, flung it open, and 3 officers stormed in. With guns drawn, they swept the house, yelling commands, "Clear upstairs. Secure the rear entrance." Minutes later, they found the back window pried open but no one inside. "Whoever it was, they're gone," one officer said, glancing around. "This wasn't random. They cut your power from the outside breaker." Carmen stood numb. "They really want me gone. They'll do anything." The officer looked serious. "Ma'am, this wasn't a prank. You need to consider protective surveillance. You're clearly being targeted." That night, Carmen stayed at Diane's house. Neither of them slept. The next morning, Diane filed for a restraining order and petitioned the court to reopen the case, this time expanding the charges to include criminal harassment, intimidation, and attempted unlawful entry. And then came the final blow. The HOA president, Jim Carter, resigned without warning. Word spread fast. Some neighbors claimed he was stepping down for health reasons. Others whispered that the investigation into falsified documents had been fast-tracked and Jim was now cooperating with authorities to avoid prosecution. Carmen didn't celebrate. Not yet. She knew how these stories went. One racist face might fall, but the system that allowed him to flourish was still standing. Meanwhile, the defamation lawsuit filed under Concerned Residents was proceeding. Carmen's legal defense team, a group of civil rights attorneys now volunteering their time, argued that Carmen's story was protected speech and rooted in fact. But that didn't stop the pressure. Carmen was subpoenaed, forced to hand over all her social media posts, and even her financial records, despite being the victim. The stress was unrelenting. But Carmen never wavered. One afternoon, as she prepared for court, she found a letter slipped under her door. It was handwritten, barely legible, and unsigned. It read, "You may think you've won, but some of us don't forget. You don't belong here. And we'll remind you every day until you leave." Carmen took it straight to the police. This time they took fingerprints. She was done being quiet. Done absorbing their hate in silence. The next hearing in the defamation case arrived. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and even a few former neighbors. some wearing smug expressions, others unable to meet her eyes. Carmen sat beside Diane, stone-faced, ready. The plaintiff's attorney stood and began their argument. Ms. Lewis has weaponized her story to portray our community as hateful and racist, causing reputational harm, economic damage, and creating fear. The HOA has received threats. Local property values have dipped. All due to exaggerated claims and media frenzy. Carmen clenched her fists. The judge turned to Diane. Ms. Abrams, your response? Diane stood tall. Your Honor, Carmen Lewis documented everything. Every letter, every violation, every security incident. The only exaggeration here is from a community that thought they could silence her because she didn't fit their mold. What they call damage is simply accountability. And we are ready to show every receipt. Then one by one the witnesses testified. Heather, the whistleblower. Reuben from City Hall. A police officer who'd responded to the break-in. Carmen watched her truth come to life in sworn testimony. The courtroom shifted. The judge frowned deeper with each witness. But just when the case seemed clearly leaning in Carmen's favor, something unexpected happened. A new witness appeared. A woman Carmen had never seen before, a retired HOA board member named Eleanor Mayfield. She requested to testify under oath. I was part of the HOA review board 2 years ago, she began, her voice trembling. I resigned after learning how decisions were made behind closed doors. Mr. Carter and several members made comments about keeping the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. That was code. They didn't want black families. When Ms. Lewis moved in, Carter said it was his mission to make her leave. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor continued. They fabricated fines. They intercepted her mail. They even considered planting contraband on her property. Carmen's eyes widened. What? Eleanor nodded. I couldn't stay silent anymore. The judge paused, then spoke. I've heard enough. I'm dismissing this lawsuit and referring the case for further criminal review. Ms. Lewis, this court owes you an apology. Carmen finally exhaled. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Carmen heard nothing, just her heartbeat, thudding like a drum of victory. Outside, reporters rushed her. Carmen, how does it feel? Do you plan to stay in Willow Creek? She looked into the camera and said calmly, this wasn't just about a house. This was about dignity. And yes, I'm staying. My name's on that mailbox and it's going to stay there. But later that evening, as Carmen celebrated with Diane and Devin, her phone buzzed. A message. No name. Just a picture. It was of her house. Taken just minutes ago, from inside her backyard. Carmen's hands trembled as she stared at the photo on her phone. The timestamp said it was taken just 5 minutes ago. Her backyard. Dark. Still. And in the lower corner of the image, a man's silhouette barely visible. Not a threat, an announcement. A warning. Her home wasn't safe yet, not even after winning in court, not even after the world saw what had been done to her. Carmen showed Diane and Devin the photo. Diane's face went pale. They're watching. Still trying to break you. Devin stood up immediately. We call the police. Again. We're not playing games anymore. But Carmen had a different idea. She was tired of just reacting. Tired of waiting for the next attack. No, she said, voice low but strong. I'm going back home. I'm going to face them. They want me to run. I won't. The next morning, with a police escort and her lawyer at her side, Carmen returned to her house. The locks had been changed, she changed them again. The lights were rewired. Security systems were upgraded with motion sensors, floodlights, and cameras that beamed directly to the cloud. Carmen wasn't moving out, she was fortifying. Word got around quickly. Some neighbors peeked from behind blinds. Others whispered across driveways. One woman even offered a stiff nod and said, I'm sorry for what you've been through. Carmen didn't need their guilt. She needed accountability. Meanwhile, the fallout from the trial exploded in the media. HOA corruption investigations began across the state. The district attorney opened a criminal case into Jim Carter and 2 other board members. Eleanor Mayfield, the retired member who testified, was hailed a hero. She received anonymous threats, but also national support. Carmen's story was everywhere. Talk shows, morning news, legal podcasts. Black woman defies HOA racism and wins. But the war wasn't quite over. Carmen was scheduled to testify before a state housing committee on discriminatory zoning and neighborhood harassment. She was being asked to speak for everyone who couldn't fight like she did, for those forced to sell, evicted without cause or silenced by fear. Days before her testimony, something strange happened. A new family moved into the house next door. Carmen saw them unpacking. Black family, 2 kids, the mom visibly pregnant. Carmen approached them gently. "Hi, I'm Carmen. Welcome to Willow Creek." The woman looked relieved. "We were worried. Heard some weird stuff online. But we saw your story. Honestly, you're the reason we decided not to be afraid." Carmen smiled. For the first time in months, it wasn't a smile of defiance, it was joy. "If you need anything, I'm right here." But peace still had to be protected. The night before her state testimony, Carmen received another letter. No envelope. Just a folded piece of notebook paper jammed under her windshield wiper. 5 words scribbled in blocky ink: "You don't get to win." Carmen sighed. This was the last gasp of a dying sickness. She scanned it, saved it, then handed it to Diane to submit as evidence. The next morning she stood before the State Housing Committee. Room packed. Reporters scribbling. Microphones in her face. And she told it all: how the harassment began the day she moved in, how the HOA twisted rules to try and force her out, how city systems were weaponized against her, how she fought back with truth, persistence, and a fire that couldn't be put out. "This isn't just my story," she said into the microphone. "It's happening across the country. To Black homeowners. To Latinos. To anyone who doesn't fit the image of certain neighborhoods. The question is, will we keep pretending it's isolated, or will we change the system that lets it happen?" The crowd erupted into applause. Lawmakers nodded. The media spun with headlines that night. Carmen Lewis calls for change, demands protection for Black homeowners. A week later, legislation was introduced to limit HOA power, require transparency for liens, and add oversight boards for neighborhood associations. Carmen didn't just survive, she sparked a movement. Meanwhile, Jim Carter was indicted on 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy. He entered a plea deal. One of his accomplices didn't, he went to trial. Carmen testified again. This time she didn't cry. She didn't shake. She stood tall, clear, fierce. The jury found him guilty on all counts. On the day of sentencing, the judge turned to Carmen and said, "Your courage has not only brought justice here but light to an entire system. You've changed lives." Carmen didn't stop there. She co-founded a nonprofit called Keys to Dignity, helping Black and minority families defend themselves against HOA abuse and housing discrimination. Within 6 months, the group helped over 200 families. And as for Willow Creek, the HOA board was dissolved. Rebuilt from scratch with new leadership, including Carmen herself. She wasn't just a homeowner anymore. She was a voice of change. Her once racist neighbors were now surrounded by new families, diverse, strong, and unafraid. The street that once tried to bury her had become a symbol of resilience. On the anniversary of her lottery win, Carmen stood in her front yard during a neighborhood cookout hosted by her nonprofit. The kids played on her lawn. The new neighbors laughed and grilled burgers. And Carmen stood in the sun watching it all. Diane came up beside her, holding a glass of lemonade. "You did it," she said. "You really did it." Carmen looked out over the crowd. "I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted peace. But maybe sometimes you have to fight to earn it. And once you have it, you make sure nobody else has to go through what you did." Just then a young girl, no older than 7, ran up to Carmen and tugged her sleeve. "Ms. Lewis?" "Yes, sweetie?" "My mama says you're like Harriet Tubman but for houses." Carmen burst into laughter. "Well, tell your mama she might be onto something." And as the sun dipped behind the trees and music drifted into the air, Carmen finally felt it, something she hadn't known in a long, long time. Oh. Justice is not always given. It's earned through courage, truth, and relentless resilience. Carmen's story reminds us that standing up against systemic racism isn't just about survival. It's about rewriting the rules for those who come next. Your voice, your truth, and your fight can change an entire community. Never let hate dictate your place in this world. You belong. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories that uplift Black voices and expose hidden truths.